That night, London breathed with the kind of cold that only appears when a soul is preparing to leave the world. A thin mist draped itself over every rooftop like a giant mourning veil slowly lowering over the Tudor realm. And inside St. James's Palace, candles trembled in the drafts, slipping through the narrow windows, their flickers resembling the tired eyes of those keeping vigil beside a dying queen. The footsteps of the ladies in waiting slid soundlessly across the stone floor, so light it felt as if they feared even the slightest noise might awaken death itself, sitting somewhere in the shadows with its freezing hand already half extended. On the heavy oak bed lay Mary I, not the woman who once made Europe tread carefully, not the terrifying Bloody Mary of whispered fear, but a tiny, fragile figure whose bloodshot eyes still struggled to stay open, as though begging the world to let her hold on for just one more moment, one more breath, one last chance to speak what she had never spoken. Her breathing was thin as thread, yet something still smoldered in her gaze, a secret, a regret, something she refused to carry into the grave. For days, she had not slept, not because of pain, but because the truths she had spent a lifetime avoiding were returning piece by piece. The prayers, the dead, the mistakes that could never be undone, the dreams that never became real, and above all, the haunting thought of the younger sister whose name she never wished to utter. When the elderly lady-in-waiting leaned in and asked softly what Her Majesty needed, Mary did not respond immediately. She stared up at the ceiling, as if searching for her mother, Catherine of Aragon, hiding somewhere in the darkened beams. Then she whispered, so softly they had to lean in to hear, "Bring me the papers." The room seemed to grow colder instantly, as though the very walls understood this was not a request from the sick, but from someone preparing to speak her last truth. A drawer slid open with a sigh, and a small stack of papers was placed in Mary's hands. Along with the familiar quill she had once used to sign decrees that shaped the kingdom's fate, her hand trembled, not only from exhaustion but from knowing the words she was about to write would carve the final cut into history, a truth that would outlive her and rise above the burnings, the prayers, the religious disputes, and even the memories of those who loved or despised her. Outside, the wind cried against the windows. Inside, the candlelight weakened as Mary bent forward and pressed the quill to the blank page. Servants would later say her hand sometimes shook, but her handwriting never lost its firmness, as if even at death's door she clung to the authority of a queen who once defied all of Europe. At one moment she paused for a long time, her eyes seeming to pierce through the page, through time, back to the distant days when she had been a beloved princess before the world collapsed beneath her. And then, as the last candle neared its end, she whispered a sentence no witness ever forgot. Not her, never her. No one dared ask who her was, no one needed to. In St. James that night, heavy with fate, everyone understood she meant Elizabeth. And so, in the moment when breath and death stood closer than ever before, Mary I, England's first queen to rule in her own right, wrote the final secret of her life. A secret the kingdom would never hear from her lips, only through the fragile strokes of ink left on the page beneath her hand. Before she became the dying queen in the cold room of St. James, Mary I had once been a radiant, brilliant child, with bright eyes like her mother's and a shy smile the palace servants fondly whispered about, calling her the Little Pearl of England. In the mornings of 1520, long before sunlight found its way through the stained glass windows, the young princess was already seated at her harpsichord, her tiny fingers dancing across the keys as if she had been born to calm the world with music. Each time Mary laughed, Catherine of Aragon, one of the proudest and strongest women in Europe, "Someday, you will be a great queen." Mary believed it with her whole innocent heart. She had no way of knowing that only a few years later, those words would become a curse, thrusting her into a life no child should ever have to bear. The unraveling of her world did not arrive with thunder, but with whispers, quiet conversations in the great halls, distant glances exchanged during royal banquets, and the faraway look in Henry VIII's eyes when he no longer looked at his wife, no longer at his daughter, but at someone else. A name Mary had heard only faintly at first: Anne Boleyn. That was when the cracks began to spread. At first, they were only rumors. The king wished to annul his marriage to Catherine. To Mary, this was impossible. She was the legitimate daughter of a union nearly 20 years strong, but with a speed no 13-year-old could withstand. Everything collapsed. Henry VIII declared his marriage to Catherine invalid. Rome objected. Henry ignored every protest. He wanted Anne. He wanted a son. And Mary, the cherished jewel of the Tudor court, found herself erased from everything she had believed was hers. The title Princess Mary vanished. Her name was reduced to the Lady Mary, as though a stroke of ink could sever her from her own bloodline. She was forbidden to see her mother. Catherine wept, Mary wept, but Henry VIII never looked back. Soldiers eventually arrived, and Mary was taken from her mother's household, sent to Hatfield, where she was ordered to serve her infant half-sister Elizabeth I, daughter of Anne Boleyn. Thus Mary, once the most beloved princess in Europe, became servant to the very humiliation her father had created. She endured that disgrace for years. Her health faltered. She coughed constantly. Her hair thinned from stress. But when pressured to sign a document declaring her mother was not a queen and she herself was not a legitimate daughter of the king, Mary stood trembling in the cold room, tears pouring down her face, barely able to breathe. Yet she whispered, "I cannot, I will not." That defiance enraged Henry VIII so intensely he swore he would break her like a dry twig. But Mary did not break. Not when she was torn from her mother, not when Anne Boleyn rose to the throne, not even when Catherine of Aragon died alone and Mary was forbidden from seeing her one last time. On the night her mother died, Mary reportedly stayed awake until dawn, clutching Catherine's final letter, every line filled with blessings and prayers, without a trace of bitterness toward the man who had destroyed her life. Mary cried until she was empty. And from that night onward, something inside her shifted. She carried two things with her from then on: a deep festering wound and an unshakable conviction that she must restore her mother's honor at all costs. That conviction followed Mary I throughout her life. It seeped into every decision, every eruption of temper, every whispered prayer, and every execution ordered in fire. No one in her court understood why she ruled with such ferocity. But looking back, the truth is clear. She was not burning heretics. She was burning the shame her mother had been forced to endure. And when Anne Boleyn was executed, when Elizabeth I was accused and thrown into the same tower that had once held Mary, fate twisted, as though returning to Mary a bitter sliver of justice. But the things she had lost, her childhood, her mother's presence, her legitimacy, her dignity, were gone forever. From those ashes, the queen would eventually emerge, not as a triumphant monarch, but as a soul still searching for the one thing she had been denied all her life: the certainty that she deserved to exist. From a princess walking through gilded corridors, to a child stripped of her own name, to a teenager abandoned by her father, to a woman raised in the shadow of humiliation, Mary I learned a brutal truth early. Everything could be taken from her, except her pain. And that pain is what carried her forward, shaping each chapter of her life, until her final night on her deathbed, when she lifted her pen and wrote the last secrets she would ever leave behind. And it was that very pain, carved into her like a mark that would never fade, that carried Mary I to the strangest moment of her life. The moment she reclaimed the throne that had once been torn from her mother's hands. But when fate turns its wheel, it never turns gently. It did not place the crown on Mary's head with reverence, but with the exhausted sigh of a country worn thin, with the confusion of a divided court, with the sharp, measuring eyes of people who did not trust her, did not love her, but were now forced to call her Your Majesty. And in that moment that looked so much like triumph, Mary understood a truth she had likely known all along. The throne was not an answer, it was another question, one harsher, deeper, and more merciless than anything she had ever endured. People said that on her first night as Queen of England, Mary I did not sleep in the grandeur of Hampton Court, nor in the chamber that had once belonged to Anne Boleyn, nor in the wide rooms Elizabeth I would later turn into symbols of a golden age. She slept alone in a small, dim room, with no attendants, no bright lamps. Only her mother's old cloak laid beside her bed, like a talisman against the fear rising from her past. For Mary understood, becoming queen could not erase a stolen childhood. It could not undo the wound carved by Henry VIII, nor wash away the loneliness she felt the day her mother died, nor silence the image of Elizabeth I, the child who had pushed her from her rightful place. Growing stronger each day, a living reminder that this world's affection always belonged to someone else. But Mary had no right to be weak. A country torn to shreds by religious conflict awaited her decisions. A court filled with faces she knew would betray her the moment she faltered, stood watching her every move. And the belief that had consumed her since childhood, the belief that her mother had been wronged, drove her to act swiftly, forcefully, and without hesitation. Mary stepped onto the throne not as a victor, but as someone repaying a generational debt to fate. She believed that if she could restore Catholicism, repair what Henry VIII had destroyed, make England pray in the tongue her mother once prayed in, then Catherine's soul might finally rest. And her own soul might rest too. But as Catholic masses returned, as Latin prayers echoed in the cathedrals, Mary realized that the crown brought no comfort. It only opened more roads she was doomed to walk alone. For the loneliness of a queen is not the loneliness of a child. It is heavier. It has an echo. It takes the shape of the court's scrutinizing stares, of whispers in long corridors, and of the endless silence from the husband she believed God had sent her. Philip II arrived in England like a tall, dark shadow. Cold, beautiful, distant. Mary looked at him and believed with all her battered heart that God had finally shown her mercy. Finally, she would have a family, a child, a legacy she had dreamed of her entire life. But Philip did not look at Mary the way she looked at him. In the cold gray eyes of the Spanish prince, 11 years younger than she, there was no admiration, no affection, perhaps only courtesy, duty, and political strategy. They said that when Philip walked into the wedding ceremony, Mary gazed at him with the eyes of a woman who believed the whole world was beginning anew. But Philip looked at her as one looks at an ally, nothing more. On their wedding night, Mary trembled not from cold, but from hope. But the next morning, when Philip left the room without a gentle word, that hope shrank, then dried, then became a tiny grain of dust lodged in her chest. And she told herself it was merely shyness from a new husband. But in the nights that followed, Philip did not come. And when duty called him back to Spain, Mary stood on the balcony watching his white ship disappear into the gray mist, unaware that the emptiness he left behind would never leave her again. It would follow her, growing heavier, darker, until the day she became convinced she was with child. The child she believed was a miracle. The child she believed would heal every wound. The child she believed would bring Philip back to her. And that child did not exist. No one understood how completely this shattered her. A person who lives by pain does not fear death, but they fear hope. And when hope breaks, what remains is not anger, it is emptiness. That emptiness would carry Mary I toward the final night of her life, the night she wrote her last secret. But before reaching that secret, a greater darkness awaited her. The darkness of believing there was life inside her. The darkness of believing she would finally become a mother, and the darkness of the truth that the one thing Mary desired most was the one thing she would never touch. But fate was not finished with her. It did not stop at abandonment or at giving Mary the first a marriage cold enough to freeze every tender hope she had ever carried. It did not stop at placing a crown on her head so heavy that even the quietest mornings made her feel as if she might collapse beneath it. Fate had one more cruelty to offer, one sharper than all the rest: hope. The hope of a woman who had waited her entire life to become a mother. The hope of a heart that believed that if she could have just one child, everything stolen from her in childhood, her mother's honor, her father's affection, the respect of an entire court, would finally be restored. And that fragile hope began with signs so small they seemed meaningless: a faint wave of nausea, a moment of dizziness after standing too quickly, a flutter in her chest when she overheard ladies-in-waiting whisper about a future prince. Mary clung to each sign the way a drowning woman clings to any piece of driftwood. She pressed her hand gently against her belly and whispered to herself, "God has blessed me." God had heard her prayers, prayers poured for years against the cold chapel walls, prayers soaked into incense smoke and the sound of kneeling, prayers born from the shattered heart of a woman who only ever wanted to be loved. The court stirred with excitement. Letters spread across Europe. Churches rang their bells. Philip II was informed that his wife carried the next heir of the Habsburg line. And Mary, the woman once deemed unworthy even to exist, felt herself standing straighter, breathing easier, living more boldly. She began imagining the child's face, imagining whose hair it would have, whose smile, which voice would one day call her mother, a word she had never been allowed to speak to Catherine in the lonely years of their separation. In her mind, Mary saw Catherine smiling from afar, blessing her, and so hope grew like a flame, warm, flickering, but painfully easy to extinguish. And then, Mary's belly began to swell, slowly, gradually, just enough for her to believe, just enough for an entire kingdom to believe, just enough for prayers to rise louder than they ever had before. But there was one strange thing. No one could hear a heartbeat, no movement, no signs of life, only silence. A silence so long Mary did not dare name it, and when the midwives were summoned, they exchanged looks. Yet none of them could speak the truth. Mary looked at them with the eyes of someone who had survived more wounds than one lifetime could hold, and they could not bring themselves to shatter her final hope. For if they did, who among them could endure the sound of her breaking? So the court waited for the prince, waited for the first pang of labor, waited for a sign, for a cry, but all they received was another silence. A silence more terrifying than the night Catherine died. And then one morning, without pain, without blood, without any change at all, Mary woke and understood that the child had never existed. Perhaps it was the hallucination of a body crushed by stress, or the reaction of a soul abandoned for too long. Perhaps it was fate's final mockery. Perhaps a curse planted the day Henry VIII discarded her mother. But whatever it was, it broke Mary completely. She did not scream. She did not cry. She did not tear the room apart. She simply sat on her bed, staring into the void before her, as if her soul had slipped quietly away. Servants later whispered that in that moment Mary aged 20 years. Deep lines carved themselves into her once beautiful, sorrowful face. Her eyes reddened, yet no tears fell, for sometimes pain becomes so immense that a person can no longer cry. That is when it begins to eat them from the inside out. A young maid, too young to know history, too young to grasp Catherine's suffering or Mary's stolen childhood, stood frozen in the corner and whispered, "The Queen is breaking." But Mary did not break. Not fully. She cracked in the way a small fracture can eventually split the entire length of a life. And from that fracture, A desperate need took root, the need to preserve the only thing left that could justify her existence, the need to protect the throne from Elizabeth I, the girl Mary believed would destroy everything she had fought to restore. She had no child, but she had power. She had legitimacy. She had God behind her. And she had pain, the most dangerous weapon any human being can wield. From that moment on, Mary began to write letters, decrees, last instructions, plans designed to stop Elizabeth I until Mary's final breath. And finally, she wrote her will. A will carved from the wounds of a betrayed life. A will without Elizabeth's name, not even once. A will Mary believed would become her confession, her declaration, and her final curse upon a world that had taken everything from her. But before she set down the last line, there was one truth Mary still did not understand. Sometimes, the thing we try hardest to control is the very thing that runs from us the fastest. And then, in the silence heavy as fog pressing upon St. James's Palace, Mary I understood she could no longer delay. She had lost far too much in her lifetime to believe that fate would grant her mercy now. She did not have the child the entire nation awaited. She did not have comfort from Philip II. She did not have a family. She did not have a future. But she still possessed one thing Elizabeth I could not yet touch: the power to decide what happened after her death. And so Mary asked for the small writing table to be brought to her bedside. Not a royal gilded desk, but the old oak one she had always used when writing letters to Philip whenever loneliness hollowed her out. They placed upon it blank paper, a quill, and a bottle of ink dark as a well. Candlelight trembled. Servants stood against the walls holding their breath, as if even the softest sound might snap the last thread tying Mary to life. Mary picked up the quill. The tip touched the paper, and for a moment she paused, not because of pain or hesitation, but because she felt the entirety of her past rushing through her veins. Catherine, Henry, Anne, Elizabeth, Philip, all the years of humiliation, all the years spent fighting to prove her legitimacy, they passed before her like a blurred reel of film, and Mary, who had battled darkness her entire life, suddenly felt she was writing not merely a legal document, but a confession, a prayer, a curse. The first line appeared. Steady, clear, unshaken. The handwriting of someone who had lost hope but never lost will. Mary, by the grace of God, Queen of England. She stopped. Something stabbed beneath her ribs, not from illness, but from the bitter irony. All her life she had only wanted recognition as Catherine's lawful daughter, yet here she was, signing herself with an endless string of grand titles she barely recognized. Queen of England, Spain, France, Jerusalem, titles so numerous they meant almost nothing beside the simple truth: she was dying alone. Mary continued writing. The next line explained the reason for her will: being with child, a phrase that if spoken aloud would have caught in her throat, for in that moment Mary wrote a lie she herself knew was no longer real. But she could not admit it, not before the court, not before the world, not before God. And certainly not before Elizabeth. If Mary admitted the truth, that she was not pregnant, everything she had fought for, every sacrifice, every drop of suffering would unravel. If she admitted she had no heir, then she had to accept the throne would fall to Elizabeth. And that was the one thing Mary I could never allow. She wrote about Philip II. My most dear and well-beloved husband. The ink bled slightly, as if the paper itself sensed the falsehood. For Mary knew she loved Philip 10 times more than he had ever loved her. But in her will, she still clung to him, granting him authority, trying to weave him into the dreams she herself could not fulfill. Mary wrote of her wish to be buried beside her mother, Catherine of Aragon, the only person she had ever loved without condition. She imagined the two of them resting together in some great cathedral, finally reunited after years of forced separation. Mary believed that there, Catherine would no longer be alone, and neither would she. But whenever the quill moved toward anything concerning Elizabeth I, Mary's hand faltered. Long stretches of blank space appeared, not the blankness of paper but of hatred, of old wounds, of bitterness turned solid. Mary did not write Elizabeth's name. Not once. She did not write my sister. She did not write my heir. There was no greeting, no farewell, no last blessing, not even the cold dignity of a formal acknowledgement, only a void, cold as stone, cold as a grave, cold as the lifelong resentment that had shaped her. Mary continued writing about debts to be paid, alms for the poor, the restoration of monasteries she believed were the backbone of her faith. But beneath every sentence lay a truth no one could see. Each line was an attempt to keep the world from falling into Elizabeth's hands. This will was not merely the last words of a dying queen. It was a battle Mary knew she was losing, but one she would fight until her final breath. When she lowered the quill to sign her name, the room nearly stopped breathing. They said Mary stared into the ink so long it seemed she hoped her mother's face might appear in it. And when the final stroke of her name closed, she whispered a line only the nearest attendant heard. Nahur. 2 words, small, but enough to reveal that even though she had finished the will, she had never finished bleeding. But fate did not allow her to keep that secret for long. For 3 weeks later, when death entered her chamber like an old, familiar companion, Mary I was forced to write one last amendment, one that shattered her heart one final time. She had to admit she had no child, and Elizabeth I would inherit the crown. But fate, as always, did not allow Mary I to hold on to her illusion for long. Only 3 weeks after she signed her will, her body grew so exhausted that every breath felt as though it was being pulled from her by a cold, invisible thread. The pains that had once been dull began spreading downward into her abdomen, upward into her chest, forcing her to sit upright at night, trembling in the darkness. The courtiers whispered. The servants avoided her eyes, and the priest was summoned more often than each time with a look he tried and failed to hide. Then one misty morning, when Mary pressed her hand against her belly, the place where she had once believed a life was growing, she felt nothing. No movement, no warmth, no promise, only emptiness so vast she felt that if she breathed too deeply, it would echo like an empty room. Mary understood. No one needed to speak. No one needed to examine her. No one needed to guess. She was the one who had waited. She was the one who had hoped. She was the one who had imagined newborn's cry echoing through the palace, and she was the one who had to face the truth. The child had never existed. Mary sat perfectly still, like carved stone. She did not cry. She did not scream. She did not ask why. For somewhere deep inside, she had always known fate had never favored her. It had not favored Catherine. It had not favored children stripped of their titles. It had not favored the souls burned for their faith. And now, it did not favor Mary. That afternoon, as sunlight cut through the window in a thin blade, Mary called for another document to be written, a codicil. An amendment to her will. The servants exchanged glances, understanding exactly what this meant. Mary had to put into writing the truth she could not bear to say aloud, the truth that she had no heir. Paper was brought, ink was poured. The air grew cold, as though the room itself were preparing for a funeral, not of Mary, but of her hope. Mary lifted the quill. This time her hand shook. This time her handwriting lost its firmness. This time she wrote not as a queen, but as a woman who had lost the one thing that might have saved her soul. Each sentence, each letter, felt like a stone dragging her heart downward. She wrote that she was not certain she was with child. The words cut through her like a blade. Each word required her to pause, breathe, and force herself to continue. For writing the truth is often more painful than the truth itself. Then she wrote the next line, the line Mary I had avoided her entire life. My next heir and successor. The servants lowered their eyes. None dared look at her, for everyone knew which name came next, even if no one dared say it aloud, Elizabeth. But Mary did not write Elizabeth I's name. She wrote only, the next heir according to the laws of this realm. No name, no acknowledgement, no hint that Mary accepted Elizabeth as her sister or even as part of her family. The sentence was so cold that everyone present felt the temperature drop, as if the air itself recoiled. It was not that Mary hated Elizabeth as a person. It was that Elizabeth embodied everything Mary feared: youth, brilliance, confidence, the ease with which a kingdom adored her, things Mary had never known. Elizabeth was the future, and Mary was the past. Elizabeth was light, Mary was shadow. Elizabeth was a beginning, Mary knew she was nearing her end. The quill trembled, the ink spread, and when Mary attempted to write the final line, she could not. A long silence followed, then a breath, deep drawn out, like the dying exhale of an entire dynasty. At last, Mary wrote, I commend my realm to her. A weightless sentence, yet containing the sorrow of 3 generations. When she set the quill down, Mary stared into the empty space before her as though looking at Catherine herself, as though apologizing for not giving England a child, apologizing for failing to alter destiny, apologizing that in the end Elizabeth I would ascend the throne. But there was something else in Mary's eyes, the quiet acceptance that every battle fought against fate ends the same way, with surrender. The servants carried the codicil away. Mary lay back down. The room returned to silence. A long, deep silence. The kind that feels like the first true rest after a lifetime of exhaustion. And in that darkness, Mary I knew. Her final words to the world had been written, not spoken, but formed in trembling lines of ink, blurred at the edges, carrying the full weight of a woman who had always been forced to be stronger than any human should ever be. And then, when the codicil was carried away, Mary I lay back on the old wooden bed, staring up at the faded ceiling, as though she were looking through it to the sky of a distant time. The time when she was still a little girl standing beside her mother, hearing the waves of Cambridgeshire break against the rocks. The time before everything collapsed. Her body was so exhausted that each breath had to be pulled from her by the last strength her soul could gather. The hands that had once signed decrees, once trembled with hope for a child, once clutched letters to Philip II, were now too weak even to lift the blanket on her chest. Servants wiped the sweat from her brow in turns, but Mary no longer felt much of anything. Everything seemed faded, far away, as though the world itself was slowly withdrawing from her reach. In the room, whispers floated as lightly as a breeze. A priest stood beside the bed, chanting prayers for the dying. Candlelight flickered across Mary's face, a face that had once been proud, fierce, determined enough to reshape a nation, now softened into the face of someone who had only sorrow left. She listened to the Latin prayers she had loved since childhood, but they no longer thundered in her heart. They echoed like distant memories from a dream she had been outside of for too long. After a moment, Mary turned her head to the right, slowly, so gently that no one would have noticed unless they looked closely. She gazed at the wall where Philip's portrait hung, not the grand one displayed for ambassadors and visiting nobles, but the one Mary kept near her bed, the one she often looked at on the nights Philip did not come, the nights she believed she was carrying his child, the nights she begged God for a miracle. Her eyes settled on the face that had shaped the final chapter of her life, and, in a wordless confession, her lips trembled slightly, as if attempting a smile she no longer had the strength to complete. Some claimed Mary spoke at that moment, very softly, like wind slipping through a crack, though no one heard clearly except a single word: Philip. One maid believed Mary was asking for his forgiveness, another thought she was calling him home. But perhaps Mary was simply telling herself that love, even unreturned, had been the only thing she truly possessed. The candle wavered again, as though her soul were considering leaving her body. Then Mary looked to her left, not at a portrait, but at emptiness, the emptiness she had never been able to fill, the emptiness named Catherine, her mother, cast aside, dethroned, abandoned in loneliness. Mary stared into that empty space as though Catherine stood there, arms open. She tried to lift her hand, but managed only a few inches before it fell again, weightless as air. A breath left her lips, long, thin, fragile, like smoke disturbed by a fingertip. The attendants leaned in, listening. Mary whispered, her voice breaking like the final strand of thread. "Mother, I am coming home." The prayer stopped. No one moved. The priest placed his hand on Mary's forehead, not to bless her, but to feel the warmth slipping away, and the moment his hand touched her, Mary closed her eyes, a soft closing, peaceful, like a child drifting to sleep after a day far too long. Silence filled the room, a silence unlike any that had ever existed before, the silence of an ending. But just when they thought Mary had left the world, her lips parted again, as if something remained unsaid. One more breath, very small, very frail, and one sentence, just one. Enough to echo across centuries, the final words of a soul who understood that everything she had built, everything she had fought for, all the pain and rage she had carried, had dissolved into nothing. Forgive me. No one knew who Mary the First was speaking to. Elizabeth, Philip, her mother, herself. No one will ever know. But after that last whisper, Mary fell completely still. No more breath, no more trembling, no more struggle. A queen, one who had lived her entire life in fire and tears, finally slept. And so, as the morning sun slipped gently through the dark red curtains, a reign ended. Not with trumpets or triumph, not with the grandeur of sovereign power, but with a silence deep as a well, the silence of a woman too tired to go on living in a world that had never once been gentle with her. And when Mary the First closed her eyes, the world did not change at once. The room remained dark, the candle still burned, the servants still stood in silence, but it was no longer the silence of waiting. It was the silence of finality. A young maid began to cry, but her tears made no sound. The priest traced the sign of the cross slowly, as though moving gently could somehow slow time itself. But time did not slow. It only paused for a single heartbeat, just long enough to record the moment a soul left its body. Then it continued forward, carrying with it the tremor that all of England would feel in the days to come. News of Mary's death was not announced with shouting. It traveled through soft footsteps, half-closed doors, whispers heavy with caution. The court knew well, Mary's death was not simply the passing of a woman. It was the transfer of power, a shift in religion, the return of a future Mary had fought against with every breath in her life. And the very first thing the council did was not pray for Mary. It was to lock down the news. No one could cry too loudly. No one could run from the chamber. No one could allow Elizabeth I to know before the council agreed on how to present it. The death of a queen, especially a divisive queen like Mary, was always perilous. One misstep could spark riots, could ignite the Catholic factions. It could embolden foreign powers. A group of close courtiers was immediately sent to secure the treasury keys, sift through Mary's papers, and search for any last instructions Philip II might have sent. But Philip had sent nothing. He was in Spain. When told Mary was gravely ill, he wrote only a short note saying he felt a little regret. A little, nothing more. And now, with Mary dead, his attendants in Madrid looked at one another, unsure how to deliver the news. Knowing full well Mary had loved him far more than he had ever cared for her. Meanwhile, in the corner of the chamber, Mary's body began its final preparation. They changed her into ceremonial robes and placed a small wooden cross upon her chest. But a cruel truth lingered. Even in death, Mary's face did not rest. It seemed she was still thinking, still worrying, still watching the things she had not been able to repair. Her eyes were shut, but not soft, closed like doors pressed tight by sorrow left unsaid. Then the court sent for Elizabeth. The news reached Elizabeth I in the most Tudor of ways, not with tears, not with family solemnity, but with political caution. A royal messenger rode to Hatfield House, where Elizabeth lived, watched, suspected, but never broken. When he bowed and said, "Your sister, the Queen, is dead," Elizabeth did not cry, she did not tremble, she did not gasp. She simply stood still, her gray-blue eyes widening, not with grief, but with comprehension. When he sang to her, the words flowed through her but stopped before she passed out. Watched with grief, but with comprehension that the world had just opened a door she had been waiting her whole life to walk through, even if she had never spoken of it aloud. Comprehension that the balance had shifted. According to the records, Elizabeth then walked into the garden. The autumn sky was dim, the trees shedding their leaves as though clearing space for a new age. She knelt on the ground, an act so unexpected the messenger did not dare breathe. She touched the earth and whispered the words history still repeats today. "This is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes." She did not mention Mary. She did not mention the childhood torn apart. She did not mention the months spent imprisoned in the tower. She did not mention the countless nights of fear when Mary suspected her of treason. Elizabeth did not mourn her sister, but she understood one truth clearly. Mary had been the final barrier between her and the throne. And now that barrier was gone. While Elizabeth walked beneath the bare winter branches, the court in London rushed to prepare for a new coronation. Catholic service books were locked away, Latin hymns folded shut. The fire Mary had lit to bring England back to Rome dimmed within hours of her death. Because Elizabeth was a different wind, a wind strong enough to blow an entire dynasty in a new direction. At Westminster, Mary's body was placed in a coffin. There were no loud cries, no widespread lamentation. The people of London, weary from years of burnings, stood along the road in silence, not triumphant, not grief-stricken, merely silent. A strange silence of a nation caught between two eras. And when Mary's coffin was lowered into the crypt, the place she once hoped would reunite her with her mother, the court had already decided otherwise. They placed her in a temporary vault, a place no one imagined Elizabeth I would one day be placed above her. A place without Mary's name, without her likeness, without a song in her memory, only cold stone. The stone door shut with a soft click. So soft it could have been mistaken for the wind. But for Mary I, it was the final sound of a life torn apart from within. No child ever called her mother. No husband ever held her hand at the end. No court ever truly mourned her. No heir carried her bloodline forward. She left the world the same way she lived in it, alone. And above ground, as London drifted into a misty afternoon, a new era was beginning, the era of Elizabeth I, the era Mary had fought against until her very last breath, an era that not even Elizabeth herself knew would become the most dazzling age in England's history. When the stone door finally closed over Mary I's coffin, another door, larger, brighter, and far more terrifying, opened at Hatfield House. Elizabeth stood in the freezing garden, the wind sweeping through her fire-red hair, swirling the last fallen leaves of autumn around her dress. No one called her Lady Elizabeth now. All the accusations, the suspicions, the months of surveillance, the long fearful days locked in the tower, all of it evaporated into the air like mist disappearing at sunrise. She stood there with her eyes wide, not from grief, but from something she hardly dared to name: power. It did not come with trumpets or cheering crowds or hurried proclamations. It came as a whisper carried by the cold wind. "You have won." A courtier bowed so deeply his shoulders trembled, not from cold, but from fear of the young woman who now held England's fate in her hands. "Your Majesty," he said, addressing her with that title for the first time. Elizabeth didn't answer at once. She inhaled slowly, taking in the smell of wet earth, damp grass, and a freedom she had waited years to touch. All of it blended together into a single, silent sound inside her mind. At last, and she walked, each step light as a feather, yet strong as a drumbeat of fate. In that moment, Hatfield House became too small for her. The next day, as Elizabeth's convoy moved toward London, crowds poured into the streets. They did not shout wildly, nor cheer with frenzy. Instead, there was a restless anticipation, half caution, half hope. Weathered faces and tired hands reached out to brush the edge of her sleeve, as if confirming their new queen was real. Catholics watched her with unease. Protestants watched her with hope. But everyone understood. A new reign had begun. Elizabeth sat upright in the carriage, her gaze not on the people or buildings, but fixed on the city ahead, on Westminster, on the throne Mary had just vacated, on a kingdom that needed something only she could give: stability. When the carriage halted at the city gate, the wind rose sharply as if testing her resolve. But she did not blink, hesitate, or tremble. She was no longer the Elizabeth who had sobbed for mercy in the tower or written an 11-page plea declaring her innocence. She was the Elizabeth shaped by fate, sharp as a blade, soft as a whisper, burning like a flame rising from cold ash. She walked through corridors where Mary had once pressed forward under the weight of sorrow embedded in every stone. Elizabeth moved lightly, swiftly, fully aware. She knew Mary had tried to shut this door in her face, but Mary was gone now, and Elizabeth understood better than anyone. History is written by the living, not by the buried. The first council meeting began that very night. Nobles in mourning clothes sat along a long oak table, their faces tense, uncertain. No one knew what Elizabeth would do, whether she would punish Mary's loyalists, whether she would take a religious side, whether she would strike swiftly. Instead, she spoke just one sentence, soft, short, decisive enough to open her entire age. "I have no wish to open windows into men's souls." No forced belief, no death for faith, no fires. With that one sentence, England exhaled and the Elizabethan era began. In the days that followed, Elizabeth acted quickly. She halted the heresy trials, ended the burnings, allowed moderate worship to resume, and quietly dismantled Mary's Catholic mandates. The court did not say it aloud, but all understood. Elizabeth was reshaping the religion of the kingdom, not brutally, but with a softness that made her authority absolute. Far away in Spain, when news of Mary's death reached Philip II, he sent only one brief message: "I felt a reasonable regret." Reasonable, not profound, not painful, reasonable. Nothing revealed the brutal truth more clearly. Mary had loved a man whose heart had never been hers. On the day Elizabeth finally took her throne, she paused for a heartbeat before stepping into the great hall. No one heard her words, but an attendant later swore she whispered, "My life is beginning." Beneath the earth, Mary lay in darkness, without a grand tomb, without hymns. Above ground, the morning sun caught Elizabeth's blazing hair, and for the first time in years, England felt the future unfolding before it. When Mary I's stone door closed, fate predictably did not end her story at the throne. Fate never cared how someone lived. It cared only where they would lie when it was over. And Mary, who fought until her final breath to escape Elizabeth's shadow, to keep Elizabeth from the throne, to block the future Elizabeth represented, ended up in the very place she feared most, beneath Elizabeth. How long had she fell in love? How many years had she been living beneath Elizabeth? When Elizabeth I ascended the throne, one of the first matters the court needed to settle was Mary's burial. According to Mary's will, the one she wrote while she still believed she was pregnant, she wished to be buried beside her mother, Catherine of Aragon. Mary had spent her entire life trying to restore her mother's dignity. Her final wish, small and humble, was simply to rest beside her. But Elizabeth did not grant it, not because she hated Mary, but because she knew better than anyone that bringing Catherine of Aragon into Westminster would ignite a political symbol too large, too dangerous, too volatile for a Protestant England she was about to rebuild. And so Mary was placed in a temporary vault, small, unadorned, with no monument, like a whispered reminder that her reign was over and that England wished to preserve little of it. Mary lay there, alone, no mother, no husband, no child. Years later, when Elizabeth I died, the court had to decide where to place the second Tudor queen, the one Europe called Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the sovereign who brought England into its golden age. And then came a decision none of them realized would become one of history's most cutting ironies. Elizabeth's coffin would be placed in Mary's vault, but on top of Mary. Elizabeth's coffin, larger and heavier, was lowered directly above the worn stone where Mary rested. By then, Mary's wooden coffin had already begun to rot, fading just as her memory had faded in the heart of the nation. Elizabeth's coffin was set above hers, a final punctuation mark placed by history on the older sister's life. No one objected, no one defended Mary, no one mentioned her final wish. No one spoke of Catherine again. And so they lay there, two sisters who had once suspected one another, feared one another, fought one another, tried desperately to erase one another, now locked into the same darkness, sharing the same cold earth, the same cramped space one of them had never wanted. But fate had one last cruelty left. Years later, James I, the son of Mary Stuart and the grandson of Margaret Tudor, commissioned a new monument for the two queens. He ordered a double effigy sculpted in white marble, set above their vault, bright, ornate, glittering under the candlelight of Westminster. But when the monument was unveiled, everyone noticed the same thing. It honored Elizabeth. Elizabeth's face was carved larger. Her name was engraved more prominently. The praises etched across the stone celebrated her reign, and Mary was reduced to a single small line. In Latin, rushed, cold, faint. Partners both in throne and grave. Here rest we two sisters, Elizabeth and Mary. We two sisters share this throne and this tomb. Mary stood before Elizabeth in life, and lay beneath Elizabeth in death. There was no trace of Catherine of Aragon, no mention of Mary's suffering, no acknowledgement of her sacrifices, her despair, or the unreturned love she gave Philip II. Nothing but erasure, the erasure history reserves for those who lose. Visitors at Westminster bow before Elizabeth's monument, praise her age, write books about her, perform plays and sculpt statues. Mary lies beneath them, silent, unseen, forgotten, her name carved so small many pass by without noticing it at all. And so she, who lived a life starved of affection, suffocated by isolation, misunderstood by her people, and haunted by the need to prove herself, was finally buried in oblivion. History did not call her a tragic queen. It called her Bloody Mary. And by placing her beneath her successor, history pressed that accusation into stone one more time. Above her, Elizabeth's effigy glows in the candlelight. Below her, Mary lies, where light never reaches. A sad ending, a cruel irony. A destiny shaped by the very forces Mary fought her entire life to resist. And perhaps, if her spirit still lingers in Westminster Abbey, the deepest wound is not that Elizabeth rests above her, but that even in death she was not returned to her mother. And so, after all the storms, the struggles, the invisible battles between two souls bound by blood but divided by fate, the story does not end with trumpets or light, but in the quiet stillness of Westminster Abbey, where two sisters at last lie silent beneath the same stone vault. Every day, hundreds walk into the Abbey. They lift their eyes toward Elizabeth I's monument, their faces glowing with admiration for a golden age, an undefeated queen, an eternal icon. They wander through the corridors, whispering about Shakespeare, about Francis Drake, about the sails that carried England across the world. Then they move on, passing the grand tomb, reading the shining inscription, praising Gloriana, smiling, bowing, leaving a small flower. And they continue walking. Few know that beneath their feet, separated by only a thin layer of stone, lying in the darkness beneath Elizabeth's coffin, is Mary I. Few pause long enough to notice the small Latin line carved beside them. A line that says nothing about her suffering, nothing about her ravaged life, nothing about the child who never came, nothing about the mother she loved with every breath. Just one cold sentence, like history's final taunt. Partners both in throne and grave, but history has its own voice, and it is not always fair. If you listen long enough inside Westminster, right after the tourists leave and the lights dim, you might feel something else. Not Elizabeth's echo, but a faint sigh, so soft you cannot tell whether it is the wind or the soul of the woman the world named with a title she never chose for herself. Bloody Mary. A name that says nothing of a stolen childhood, nothing of a little girl's world collapsing as she tried desperately to hold on to her mother, nothing of the prayers whispered from a broken heart, nothing of the love she carried for Philip II, nothing of the fragile hope of pregnancy, the only hope that might have saved her soul, nothing of the nights of illness, the tears, the terror she hid beneath a crown that grew heavier each year. And if you stand long enough by the entrance to the crypt, when only a single candle flickers against the draught, you might sense what time has failed to bury. That Mary I was not the monster history made her out to be. She was simply a woman who had never been loved in the way she needed. A woman who had stood far too long in other people's shadows. A woman who never had a chance to live inside the gentleness every human being deserves. Elizabeth had the light. Mary had the darkness, and together they were two halves of the same tragedy, the tragedy of sisters pulled into the machinery of kings, of churches, of politics, and of destiny itself. Two lives, two reigns, two hearts that never found each other. But in the end, they were placed in the same grave. Perhaps that is irony. Or perhaps it is time's strange way of healing. For in the darkness of Westminster Abbey, where there is no throne, no rivalry, no cold machinery of power, there are only two souls, one radiant and one quiet, lying side by side like two children finally allowed to sleep. And perhaps in that silence, Mary I finally found what she had searched for her entire life. Not power, not honor, not triumph, but peace. In the end, history remembers crowns, battles, laws, and victories. But if you listen closely, beneath the marble, beneath the hymns, beneath the stories told and retold until they harden into legend, you can hear something softer, something human, something real. Mary I and Elizabeth I were never just queens. They were daughters. They were sisters. They were children shaped by a father's ambition and a kingdom's fear. Two lives forged in fire, pushed onto thrones they never asked for, forced to become symbols in a world that rarely cared about the women behind the titles. One carried the weight of her mother's sorrow, the other carried the burden of surviving it. One clung to faith, the other clung to the future. One ruled through pain, the other ruled through brilliance. And both paid for their reigns with the loneliness only a crown can bring. Today, visitors bow before the marble of Elizabeth, radiant in death as she was in life. Few notice the silence beneath their feet. Where Mary lies in a darkness history rarely illuminates. But perhaps that silence holds the truth more clearly than any monument ever carved above it. Taylor forks at Scott's kitchen. The thick pot of bacon is... For here, under the vaulted ceiling of Westminster Abbey, the storm is over. No more fear, no more rivalry, no more names sharpened by politics. Just two sisters, finally beyond the reach of power, beyond the demands of a restless kingdom, resting in the only place fate ever allowed them to be, together. And maybe, after a lifetime of fighting shadows, Mary I finally found the one gift the world never gave her: peace.